that they'd love to be here but can't be here. So our topic for today is all about good listening, and how that links to quality. So I think this article is a nice segue from last time's discussion around depth of data and depth of and richness and those kinds of issues that we were discussing last time, also linked to quality. And we've got Rona presenting today for us. So thank you, Rona.
Thank you.
So do you want to just tell me when to move to the next slide?
So I'm not going to do it this way.
I think you keep muted and then we'll keep on mine. Yes.
Okay, great. Can you all hear me?
I hope that Rona is audible.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Yes, so this was in qualitative research. And so if we just move to the next slide. So the whole idea behind it was that when you're looking at qualitative research, you often spend a lot of time thinking about what questions to ask and appropriate ways to ask questions, but you're not really looking at what the listening skills are of the person doing the interview. And they called it a blind spot, and the whole listening idea. And they said, actually, it's crucial for data quality, because without good listening skills, you don't get the rich data that you need to be able to listen to encourage somebody to talk. We can go to the next one. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Wonderful. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes. Next one. Okay, so why do we need listening? Well, it's to build rapport. It creates an environment of non-judgment. And the big word there is it creates a sense of trustworthiness. Being able to listen also increases your own credibility, and they feel it's also very much involved with rigor. And I like this quote from Morse 2020, who said that excellent research requires excellent interpersonal skills in order to obtain good data. And I don't know why that was such a comment that stuck with me, but I think it is true, is that if you're going to ask for people's stories or ask for people's opinions, they have to like you, and they have to know that they are safe with you. So they,
There's with medical exceptions.
Exactly. Yes, it's so true. And it's one of those things that we don't really talk about. So it's often implicitly referred to, but it actually needs explicit consideration, which I thought was also interesting. Like, what are you doing when you're listening and how did you listen? And they'll go into quite a few details about that.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point linking to the medical interactions, because I think so many of us are used to medical consults and case histories and whatever it is that we're doing with patients. And we don't kind of make the link or the jump between a research interview and a clinical consult having similarities. And I've only really started to think about it recently with students in terms of when they fill in the ethics form, there's a question about, do you have any experience? And often they'll say no. And then I'll say to them, but actually you've done some consults with patients, so you have some experience of interviewing or doing something, and you can then extrapolate those skills across to a research interview. Yeah.
And it shouldn't be different. If we're doing good research, there shouldn't be this gap between research and interactions that are clinical or in the real world, because the information we're gathering should be applicable in terms of what jobs we're doing or how we're needing to interact with other people or make their lives better. I think that's such a crucial thing with research. It's not just about getting your degree. It's like service to others too.
Well, I think also certainly the kind of research that a lot of us are involved in is very applied. So we're always wanting to think about, how do we help people? How do we
how do we make it better?
So there should be some kind of an end goal, not just I'm going to take your story and disappear.
Once I've got those letters after my name. And I think that comes to that trustworthiness and the credibility. Is that also, why are you doing this? which isn't coming up so much into the listening side. What I thought was interesting in this one was they talk about the importance of listening and rigor. And I'm not sure that the article addressed rigor in enough detail. And I think I'll go into the implications and maybe limitations of their article, because it wasn't really research. Okay, next one. Okay, so I tried to look at, because, you know, in the article, they acknowledge that qualitative research is often seen as a soft science, and apparently that's an insult. So, which maybe it's not. Yeah.
Yes.
So, you know, what is the quantitative aspect? What are the specific skills? What's the qualitative equivalent? And I think I was kind of reaching a bit. So I took what the article said, because I think it's an interesting comparison, and then, but didn't, you know, stretch it too far. So quantitative talks about trustworthiness, which is interesting. And then the qualitative equivalent is this internal validity, like what is it true, what you're testing. The external validity is it generalizable, that word. Is it reliable, and is it objective? And then the specific skills you're looking at there are credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability. And then the quantitative aspect is the creative, the thoroughness, the congruence, the explicitness, and then is it this rich, thick description? Is it a full exploration of the phenomena through data collection? And then the rigor, prolonged engagement, persistent observation. And then they call the big tent criteria,
That's
which I thought
interesting.
was interesting, which is attention to detail, method, which, you know, the big tent is rigor and credibility, methodological thoroughness, precision of evaluation, data richness, complexity, thick description, which leads to credibility and that internal validity.
That's quite interesting how they've kind of split it up
Yeah.
there. And introduced terms I haven't seen before. The big tent criteria is quite interesting. What did they
Yes.
mean by
They
big
meant
tent?
the rigor and the credibility. So,
Okay, so
like
kind of
your research has to be
overarching, yes.
has to be under this tent of rigor and credibility.
Yeah, there's another one that I've seen added to Guba and Lincoln's trustworthiness that I'd love to explore at some point in a journal club is authenticity.
Okay.
Which is also about ensuring that you're representing the voices of communities, that you've got adequate representation of
Okay.
participant groups. And that I think is quite interesting to add here as well.
Yeah.
But I like what they're talking about with explicitness, vividness, creativity, thoroughness, congruence. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Next one. Okay, so they did, you know, it's always nice to have the specifics of how to. So, you know, things that I suppose as qualitative research, as you know, is the research is the main research instrument, because you're the one who is collecting the data. Again, this need for excellent interpersonal skills, and this point that it's not just content, wording, order, the style of the interview that's important, is that the interaction has to be good. And if the interaction is good, it means that you have listened properly. And I think we do focus a lot on what we say. And I've definitely found that with me, is I want the content to be good and to be accurate. And I don't always listen. In fact, sometimes this, and I can remember this as a student, I would get so upset if the parent or the client was actually saying something to me, because I'd lose my train of thought. So, you know, but
You're not allowed to speak.
Giving you my pearls of wisdom, wait. And I think that it also happens in medical interactions, because they want to tell you the facts.
Mm.
And the facts are almost black and white, whereas I don't think they really ever are. And that ability to listen and hold your train of thought, but also be able to take in their perspective and adapt your knowledge to what is important to them is an incredibly important skill.
That's very, yeah.
Really, especially if you feel under pressure, time pressure, and maybe a certain question that you need answered for your research. There's all sorts of pressures that I think make listening extremely difficult.
And I think research activities are stressful, especially when you're doing this kind of qualitative work, because as you say, you're juggling so much, and you're trying to make sure that you're keeping track of questions, but also not repeating things that have already been said or talked about. So I've been doing some focus groups recently for our interprofessional simulation project. And I still get nervous for those because there's a lot of juggling going on. And often you kind of then sidetrack by looking at your questions and saying, well, okay, well, we've already answered that. We've talked about that. And then you lose the listening.
Exactly.
So I guess that's why some of the people, like Smith et al., the IPA guy, talks about the need to learn your questions off by heart and to know your interview or your focus group schedule so well before you go in. But even then, I think sometimes there are curved balls or things don't go as you planned, or maybe you're not getting enough information, and then kind of throws you a bit. Yeah.
And it is scary if you get to the end and you've forgotten to ask something really important. It is a reality. So I think it is a very difficult thing.
I was thinking of your research as well, that like the answers that you were getting from the adolescents wasn't what you were hoping to talk about in the I kept on like wanting to say, no, we're not talking about that. Come back to
Yes, exactly.
And I think for me, what was also hard, I think doing focus group discussions, it adds a different element to it because you're managing different voices. And so who do you yes. So who do you listen to, and how do you ensure that you allow people to say what they want to say before you move on to the other person? I was also just thinking when I was reading the article, what is good listening? Is it me not interrupting what you speak? Or I have to really understand, but also thinking about time pressure. Very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because one person can color a whole focus group and shift the whole direction. And sometimes that's not helpful because it could be just a dominant voice.
So for me, I don't think I did much listening with focus groups. I was just managing people, making sure that we stick to time, everyone gets to have a say. And trying to bring people back to what we were talking about, which was the topic, because we're just going off topic a lot, but
And sometimes when you're doing qualitative research, almost the listening, and I am using inverted commas there, happens when you're looking at the transcript. Because then you've got time to reflect, and you've got time to see the context, and you've got time to see like themes that maybe didn't occur to you face to face. And I think I'm not excusing it, but I think that sort of listening and understanding is difficult to do on the spot.
It is. You've really got to be quite experienced. I see Charmaine's got her hand up. Charmaine, do you want to add here?
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is great. I think one of the things I struggled with when I was doing focus group with healthcare professionals, nurses and doctors is, as you say, keeping them on track, because it almost became a debriefing session for them. And I, as a researcher, felt I had the responsibility to allow them that space because they're giving me their time, but I also wanted to keep the thing on track. So I think it's a very difficult juggling act to maintain.
Absolutely, Charmaine. I was actually thinking about an example of a focus group I ran with doctors years ago around an issue of disclosure with adolescents with HIV, and it actually turned into something different to a focus group. It was a debrief, but it was also a bit of an attack session in terms of like who was to blame, and it kind of got out of hand for a bit. And at what point do you stop things or just let them run their course? And I think that's the difficult decision to make sometimes.
I think so. And allowing that conversation to flow without interrupting too much, I think, is also quite difficult.
Absolutely. I'm thinking too of Siobhan, some of our conversations that we've had around the data that you've been collecting in Charmaine's clinic, and some of the difficulties also around when do you get too involved? Is there a line where you can sometimes cross and you're starting to do more than just interview somebody. And that's also tricky, so that the listening goes hand in hand with how much you're actually offering. Siobhan, I don't know if you want to add here on that point.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that thing of, like, for me, the active listening, which, you know, I've learned in counseling, and how with active listening you reflect back to the person who's speaking what you're hearing, so they have an opportunity to kind of correct you or to say, no, that's not what I'm saying, or whatever. And I find that a very useful tool, because it helps to keep track of, like, am I understanding correctly what this person is saying? But then it can be leading, or it can be, you know, like, it's your words then in the transcript rather than their words sometimes, which Charmaine pointed out once when we were looking at like the transcript of an interview together. And but it's very tricky, because I do find that tool very helpful. And I'm also thinking about, you know, the difference between doing that one-on-one in an interview versus, like, what you guys, a number of you have spoken about, which is in a focus group, and how that's difficult. It's difficult, and I've had that experience being at the MDTs with the palliative care unit. While we haven't done it specifically for research, or, like, it's not recorded, or it's not a focus group, there's so many voices, and it's really difficult. You know, I think even for Carl, who's, like, you know, the authority figure in the room, he doesn't guide the session. He doesn't, like, say this is where it's going. Like, people speak and things come up and it goes this way or it goes that way, and you can't really control it.
Yeah. And is it our job as an interviewer to control a group, or to just let it run its course? I guess that's the question. Sure.
Yeah, letting people, like, say what they need to say and bring up what it is that is an issue for them.
Yeah. No easy answers here.
No, and I think that this is the next point. Is it's, you know, we think that listening is an innate skill, you know, but it actually, interview listening is not an everyday interaction, and it's also not natural, because and I think that that's quite a statement, you know, because what is it authentic then, you know, if it's not natural? And I think what they mean then is it's not something that comes easy, and it's not something that is innate. You have to work on it. And they also, you know, this discussion is so helpful, because I think that this is what they mean by roles and performance, you know, that what, and you know, you need to be able to be aware of those roles. And again, it comes out in the limitations. You know, if you've got a power struggle, that's a very different kind of listening environment to you know, if you're seen as neutral. So I think also to the point of active listening, which they don't use that term, but this Sharma's quote that says, delving beneath the surface of the described experience. And that comes into that insider-outsider idea, that the outsider often can understand the experience, whose role is almost to understand the experience better than the person telling the story, because they've got to bring their experience and their almost objectivity to the situation and help the person see trends, which I think is what happens with active listening. You've got to check that it's right, but you've also got to go one step further, is interpret and make sense of.
Which was what Siobhan was talking about. Yeah. But again, then that fine line between when are you putting words in someone's mouth?
Yes, versus bringing your biases in.
Exactly. So that this reflection is absolutely key in this process. Yeah, sure. Gosh.
Thank you. We get the next one. So then they go on to how to listen so people will talk. And they do talk about this idea of self-reflection. And, you know, I'm just so interested in this very simple but very powerful idea of stepping back and examining yourself, like every now and then, you know, or not every now and then, like often, you know, was I really listening? You know, what went well, what didn't go well, what could I do better next time, what were the problems? And, you know, he doesn't discuss it in terms of that, but he does ask the question, were you really listening? So the first thing is that attention, being fully present with the speaker and avoiding internal and external distractions. And not that they mention this article, But cell phones, I think, are a massive problem. And, you know, with my therapy, I'm quite interested in the latest research, for example, that says that even having a cell phone that isn't on, but the presence of the cell phone next to you disturbs how well you're going to do in your maths learning.
That's
So
amazing.
they did with maths in particular. And they said it doesn't even need to ring, but the fact that it's there and you can see it, your attention is automatically divided. So students who did their maths homework without a cell phone in the room did far better and finished quicker than students who had the phone next to them without any messages going on. They switched off the Wi-Fi. So it's just a fascinating thing how this insidious grasping for our attention has become an almost epidemic. So I think that, you know, this was before the article was written, this kind of research, but I think it's really important. And then that comprehension is signaling that they've understood. And sometimes I think your idea and Siobhan, you know, of reflecting back to them what they said, so that they can correct problems of comprehension too. And then these harder to quantify things of good intentions. You know, what are your intentions? And again, it came to that insider outsider. Is your intention to get the degree, or is your intention to understand? So
really
story and to try and make things better, and acceptance towards them. Are you coming with a certain bias that you don't? And I'm sure you've dealt with this a lot, Megan, in your genetic counseling, is you have to be so aware of acceptance and bias, and can you be non-judgmental? I think that we throw that term out. I think it is unbelievably hard to be non-judgmental. I don't think any of us are honest enough to say, you know, how hard it is. And also empathy, you know, having that real feeling for somebody without being sympathetic. I think those are hard. And one of, I think, the ways to do it that kind of makes sense to me, and it also came out from this paper, is respect and curiosity. And I think that goes a long way. Genuine curiousness and respect for who you interviewing.
Yeah, I was just thinking of a fourth year who I had a discussion with. Are we back? I'm even plugged into the internet today and it's still not behaving. I was asking, I was talking to a fourth year about, so she wants to do a project looking at concussion and people's experiences of concussion and understanding of that in a community setting. And we were talking about, well, how do you deal with a scenario where somebody comes with an explanation that doesn't align with our biomedical understanding? How are you going to manage that? And I was talking about the importance of not discounting what they bring, because that's part of the project. You want to understand what their understanding is, but at the same time, there's a need to educate to some extent, so without discounting. So if someone comes and says, well, I think it's because of witchcraft or, you know, ancestors or whatever, then one needs to somehow hold that and acknowledge that view, but at the same time offer potentially another view and say, well, you know, do you want to know a little bit more about how, you know, other people think about it, or, you know, how I think about it as researchers? So that's very tricky as well, I think, to get right. Siobhan?
Sorry, I don't know how to unraise my hand, but we had this conversation actually at the perinatal palliative care training, where obviously people have a lot of, like, people's spiritual ideas around death, and, you know, all of that comes up quite strongly. And I think it depends on what the belief is and what impact it has, because they have, like, an example that was brought up was, like, if you have a woman who's she's heavily pregnant and she's starting to bleed, or, you know, something is happening, but there's a cultural belief that she should be having sex with her husband every day, and there's like a you know, there's a belief around that, you know, the father should be connecting with the child in that way, right? But that it has medical implications, like it could actually cause a stillbirth or a miscarriage at that point, then it's important to bring it in and discuss that, right? But when it's something like, you know, you like Batley spoke about, she's had a woman who's had a miscarriage and she believes that she was bewitched by her boyfriend's wife. It was her boyfriend's wife who was angry with her and bewitched her, and that's why she lost her baby.
Sure.
And then the important thing is to for Batley in that setting, what she was saying is that it's important to integrate what are that woman's feelings and experiences around this context. Maybe there's guilt, maybe there's shame, maybe there's anger that she's not the wife. All of that stuff then needs to be integrated, and it doesn't necessarily have a medical ramification.
Mm. Mm. But then, yeah, I guess how does one address that in a way that you're still kind of holding and respecting what they are offering and listening to them, but at the same time addressing misnomers or that's a tricky one. It really does require a lot of experience and wisdom, I guess. And I guess for all of us, whether you're experienced or not, there are going to be times when you get it right and times when you don't. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so they talk about verbal and non-verbal cues, and then they go on to a different terminology, but obviously, I think it's fairly obvious that the non-verbal cues must align. And, sometimes if you've ever watched yourself in a video, you can see sometimes your non-verbal cues do give you away. So I think it's helpful to watch a video of yourself and be aware of it. I was watching an interaction with a child, and I saw how often I grabbed something from his hand to direct the task to something else. I was really horrified. I couldn't send the video to the parent because this wasn't what I was trying to do at all, and I didn't realize it was happening. So I think you do need to be aware of it and actually look at it.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking of the number of videos we've got of like audiology consults where they're explaining the results of the hearing test, and the patient is literally sitting there going, "Huh?" and they haven't stopped, looked at the patient, seen that they're not, because they're so focused on what they're doing. So I mean, it sounds simple, but I think often we don't think about the non-verbals. And
just horrified.
I'm thinking even, Megan, of one of your interactions where those patients obviously sat back, lost interest, weren't interested in the discussion further, and the counselor just went on and on and on.
Because she had to get the information. That was her job. I get it. I really get it.
Even think of my own counselling in that. I also had a very complex case 2 weeks ago, and I had to explain quite a lot of information. And the husband at the end went, "Sure, okay, that was a lot." Like, no, that's
sorry. I know it's a lot.
But at least he knew it was a lot.
But also you just some days you get it right and other days you don't. And I suppose that's the lesson, is kind of that self-reflection and that constant learning.
And also watching yourself. I think the self-reflection is important. Like, look at yourself, and it comes up later. Because they're also talking about back channel behaviors, which consist of non-verbal and verbal clues, which impact on the speaker's responses. So non-verbal being the famous head nods, leaning forward to show interest, facial expressions, etc. And then verbal questions, conveying understanding or the lack thereof, or completing speaker sentences. One of the difficulties I have with this paper is, and I hate to say it, but I think this is where CA has been very helpful.
Yes, conversation analysis.
Conversation analysis, because this is telling you things that make sense, but we haven't got equivocal evidence.
Yes.
And, for example, I mean, somebody did their, PhD on the value of a head nod in a card game, and that might seem very obvious to us that it signals understanding, but the point is that they've verified that is what happens, and sometimes advice that we give hasn't been verified. And I think if we can take these ideas and look at it from a CA conversation analysis perspective, where you look at the minutiae of the conversation turn and you examine the response in terms of just the data that you are seeing, I think it would go a long way almost to see which one of these ones are particularly helpful and when.
I was just thinking, I wonder if anybody's done a study of CA with interviews or focus groups and actually looking at practices. That would be fascinating.
And
Did you?
whether it does produce rich data. And sorry, I'm going ahead of
Absolutely,
myself,
yeah.
but I did have a problem with this in the limitations. I think there are quite big limitations, even though the content of what they're doing is amazing and so important. You know, we have to, we can't just gloss over listening as being an instinctive thing that we, you know, are good at, because I don't think all of us are.
And it's even things like, if you think about that John Heritage paper where he looked at medical interactions, and when a doctor asked, do you have any more questions versus do you have some questions? And the some questions routinely got far more yes responses. So do you have any questions, preferences, a no response. And it leads people towards a no. So a simple thing like your choice of wording there can make it, exactly. And I mean, I use that strategically in things like ethics meetings, because I'll say to people, do you have anything to add? Because that to me kind of channels them towards, you shouldn't be adding a whole lot more here. Like, we need to keep things moving. But if I said, do you have something to add, then that's kind of opening the door, you know. So you can use these kinds of tactics strategically. And it's the same as, you know, if you like doing a lot of ferocious nodding, for example, in an interview, you're kind of saying to the person, okay, all right, we're done with that point. I've had enough of that.
Speak faster.
Like hurry, you know, so that is already signaling something to them. So that would be fascinating to see if somebody has done a conversation analysis study like that.
And also, you know, something like an eye gaze, like a head nod, exactly that example, a head nod versus like, you know, is a very different thing. And a staring eye gaze or a startled eye gaze is very different to a sympathetic one. And I think that nuance hasn't really been explored here. I think they assume we know what they mean. But I'd like to see a little bit more like what is the actual result? How much richer does it make?
And what kinds of strategies help to enable somebody to talk more versus kind of shutting down?
Exactly like that heritage.
Absolutely.
And the charm that work, that, you know, that charm.
The calm, Elizabeth Stokey, absolutely. So she does conversation analysis based training with organizations where she looks at interactions, like, for example, phone calls on a hotline, and then goes in and trains people based on what she's seen in the data. So, you know, there are those kind of models. It's very labor intensive, but I absolutely agree. I think it can show some interesting findings, and make it a bit more specific in a way, rather than, you know, just be a good listener and attend to the nonverbals.
Or do you know, it's, and I think the point of this article, to be fair, was to bring awareness. And I think that it succeeded in bringing awareness. So they talked about this back channeling behaviors. So what are the constructive ones? And that signals that it's good listening and you're feeling understood. So according to studies, the speech fluency improves. It increases the cognitive flexibility of the speaker. So I think, Siobhan, that also talks to your idea that, you know, if you reflect back to somebody, or if you try and add a level of understanding, you can often get the interviewer to see things from a different perspective. It lowers levels of social anxiety at being judged. They become less defensive. This increased cognitive flexibility is similar to open to alternative viewpoints. The attitudes become more complex and less extreme, and speakers become more tolerant and aware of conflicting aspects of their attitude. If you are listening with, you know, if you're good listening.
I see Siobhan's got her hand up. Do you want to come in here, Siobhan?
Yeah, I just wanted to like respond to that, or just add to that as well, with I think that for me, my perception of it is that when I am reflecting back to the interviewer, the interviewee, the participant, that they become more engaged, and it's easier to like find avenues, or like to probe gently they become more open because they feel like they're being listened to. That's my experience of it. And it's not just like verbal reflection. It's also like in counseling, I'm trying to remember what the S stands for, but they have this acronym SOLAR. The O is for open, like that your body language must be open, and the L is for leaning forward, that you lean towards the person you're listening to. E is for eye contact, making eye contact, showing them that you're engaged. And then R is for reflecting. And that's not just reflecting verbally again, it's also like mirroring their body language. And those things also like show the participant that you're engaged with what they're saying and that you're very present and listening to them. And my feeling is that when I'm doing those things, people respond with more openness. They like, even people who are quite kind of clammed up will like start sharing more and showing more kind of, I want to say enthusiasm, but that's like quite a happy word. But I mean like more kind of interest in sharing.
Yeah, I looked it up, and the S is for sit squarely. I'm not sure what that means. Does that make sense to you?
I think it's just like sitting so that you're like directly facing them. You're not like it's difficult because I'm not physically there, but you're not like looking off to the side of them. You're like facing them directly. And then the open part is that you're not crossing your arms or, doing anything that closes your body to them.
As I'm Googling, I'm seeing another article that I'll pop in the chat from a nursing journal where they're talking about changing it from solar to surety. So sit at an angle, uncross legs and arms, relax, eye contact, touch, and use your intuition.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
it's interesting that people have worked on and developed some of those approaches.
I do think that like sitting squarely can sometimes be a bit intimidating. Like it
Yes.
can be like, it's very direct, and sometimes it's like people don't really want to be under the magnifying glass,
Yeah, exactly. Or feel that you're kind of staring at them. And I mean, the eye contact thing is interesting as well, because it's not always culturally appropriate.
You mentioned that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then negative back channel behaviors are poor listening, and it's the shorter stories that are less fluent. And I thought this was interesting. It lacked a coherent structure because, obviously they don't follow, it doesn't make sense, which often I find that if you've got good listening, it can go off at a tangent. But they found the opposite, that it lacks coherent structure, which I thought was interesting.
Sure.
Next one. Okay, so this is just a little bit of a dig at the quantitatives, but the cartoon. But yeah, so they say that part of good listening is to establish this concept called trust, and this idea that you are psychologically safe, and you have to have rapport with somebody to build trust, which is the foundation for any kind of quantitative research. Without it, you don't get data that is meaningful, and that high quality listening increases trust. And it's something that perhaps as qualitative researchers, we maybe feel that isn't a big deal for quantitative. I don't know that that's fair, but perhaps there isn't the same emphasis. I'm not sure.
And I think the trust issue is so important in our context, because there's such a mistrust of research and a history of exploitation, and so we've almost got to work. Yes.
Research that you did. That's just so important.
So there's such a need to work harder to build trust with research participants.
And I think, it's not entirely fair to say that quantitatives don't think about it. I think that's not true at all, but perhaps it's not as central as it is to getting reliable data as it is to qualitative.
Well, I think there is a lot more research coming out these days that's showing how, even with quantitative research, you still have to have a lot of these things. You've got to have the relationship, the trust, the rapport. If you're sitting and doing a battery of tests with someone, for example, you have to have that buy-in and that connection if you're actually going to get the kind of data that you want. Otherwise, people will just run away or not fill it in properly. Or Charmaine?
Sorry, Jenny, I think you just answered, well, just said what I mean, I did quite a bit of quantitative work, and I find that if they don't have trust, they're not going to give you honest answers. So your interviews are then not going to reflect the reality. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, so you
That's
absolutely
true.
need that trust. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
ethics won't let you not have it these days.
Mm.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, I think
Oh, did it jump to?
Yeah,
Oh, there we
sorry,
go.
yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so what do they say? How do you do this good listening? It's clear your mind, full attention to the speaker, no agendas, I suppose no cell phones that you can see. This idea of eye contact and acknowledging that sometimes you have a concentration lapse and to repair it as soon as possible.
So you cannot just jump in there with a question. So it says no agenda. I find that quite hard because
I know.
if I'm going to interview someone or run a focus group, I do have an agenda.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
and I'm listening because I need to listen and hear what they're saying, reflect back to them.
But you've got a
And they
research
say-
question.
Yeah, so like it's so hard to say no agenda.
Mm.
I mean, that's
Well, my
exactly-
Because we're not,
No.
we're not chatting. You know, this
No, it's not
isn't a social chat.
Yeah, over a cup of coffee.
And even then you have an agenda. You know, you're catching up on each other.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I'm thinking of agenda setting throughout all of these slides that you were talking about, Verna, and that I think a lot of the listening obviously happens throughout the interview or throughout the interaction with the patient or participant. But I think the agenda setting in those first 10 minutes of an interaction, whether it's in a research setting or a clinical setting, are so important because you clearly are going to come with an agenda as a researcher or as a healthcare professional. You're there for a task or something that you need to do in terms of a service or a research study. But I think perhaps mutual agenda setting is something that can be considered in terms of those first 10 minutes, in terms of establishing trust. Sort of really getting to assess the participant in terms of what is their understanding of what the interaction is going to be about? What are some of their concerns? Like, how are you going to adjust your interviewing or your information according to the person sitting in front of you, and kind of carrying that through, and perhaps sort of with having throughout the listening in the interaction, you kind of have to be cognizant of what you are hoping to get out of the interaction, but also what is the patient hoping to get out of the interaction. And if it is about sort of talking about something that isn't necessarily about what you came to talk about, to kind of acknowledge that as part of their agenda, that is important for them, but to summarize it and kind of lead it back to sort of a mutually, sort of an equally beneficial interaction.
And I think there also is an ethical responsibility that if the person is coming to you and you need to give them this information because it is important, that you almost have a responsibility to do that. You know, so I think that I think it is this idea of safety, protection, and acceptance, and trying to avoid judgment where you can. And also, I think being aware that the initial speaker's perspective might be different from the meaning that the speaker is trying to convey. So I think that this is this idea that sometimes people don't really understand what's going on. And sometimes people's opinion in an interview change with information or with insight. So maybe not information as much as insight. And part of good listening is to help them gain that insight. And I think that then answers that question of, you know, they've got an idea that doesn't fit with your idea. You think you could improve things if they take your idea. How do you guide them there? And I think that there is an element of that in an interview setting. As long as you're also aware of your second channel of listening, which I quite liked, is your inner dialogue. Don't tell them what you're thinking, but be aware of it. And this is something that I think we all do, is we play in, like there is another conversation going on in our head. And sometimes it's to guide the next question, or sometimes it's completely irrelevant to what's going on. I forgot to do da-da-da-da. Or, oh no, I've got to then work on this next. So that inner dialogue, I think, again, it's that self-reflection of awareness seems to be quite a key thing in terms of being a good listener.
Absolutely. But just coming back to that point on agenda, I see Charmaine's put here, could we call it a flexible agenda? So, and Megan's added, there has to be some openness and some kind of discussion of what we're doing here today. What are we talking about today? So absolutely, but again, that fine line that we were talking about with Siobhan earlier about putting words in someone's mouth. But so that's the inner dialogue. Yes. And knowing when to just hold back and not say,
and when to know that actually there is a perception that might need to change, and that would be helpful to change.
Absolutely,
On both sides, the speaker and the listener. So carrying on this this point that Siobhan brought up, reflect, provide a short summary using the speaker's word, probably what we call active listening. Reflect to understand, which is a core need for all of us. We need to be understood. It's, I think, a very great human need. Sometimes we don't realize how powerful just understanding somebody is. And Siobhan, I think you've spoken about that. And at the end of the reflection, asking, did I miss anything, for clarity and new insights? I thought that was a lovely example. Again, I'd love to see a CA thing as to what comes up.
Yes, because I mean, sitting on the ethics committee, I see so many applications where they just end with a question and there's no opportunity to say, do you want to bring up anything else that we didn't talk about? Or did I miss anything? It's often never there. It just kind of ends abruptly. So I think it's important to kind of open that conversation a bit further to something that maybe you haven't thought about.
And this idea of validations, signaling to speakers that they're worthy of attention, especially when they are doubts or uncertain. And I think a lot of us have a lot of doubts and uncertain when we're telling our stories or our experiences. Hold space, provide clarity, or shed light on issues the speaker is struggling with. So it's not just listening as a sponge, but actually helping them gain insight. And examples of validation include nonverbal behaviors like nodding, verbal signals such as thanking the interviews for sharing their experience, which is validating.
I think that's an interesting point you make, Rona, about helping people to get insight. And that puts a very different spin on what are we actually doing in an interview or a focus group. Is it really about us getting insight, or is it about us helping participants to understand their own stories and experiences? And maybe that's something we need to kind of explore in a bit more detail, is what are we actually doing here?
And how's it helping the person telling us their story?
And is that the point of the interview, to actually help them in that moment? Or is it the point of the interview and the research to help at some later stage based on the findings from a collective group of interviews? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
To be conveyed.
Something we need to think about. What are we actually doing here when we're collecting this kind of data?
And maybe saying to the person.
To also see sort of where that boundary is in those moments, in terms of, I'm just thinking of myself, like, am I being a researcher in this moment, or am I a genetic counselor in this moment, or do I need to be both?
And the hats that you're wearing. So,
are you qualified
and
to counsel?
Am I qualified to counsel, or is this starting to feel like this is actually more appropriate for a referral? Or I acknowledge that this is an issue for the patient, but perhaps that this is part of my research in terms of, that applied knowledge, that we can write up recommendations, or that this is something that needs to be addressed.
Exactly.
In a research setting, or it's hard, but I think there also has to be sort of that awareness of where the boundary is and where I can assist in that moment, and what role am I playing in that moment.
So again, coming back to that reflexive practice and being able to reflect in the moment on what is happening, and can I really deal with this, or what do we do?
So, speaking of reflection, reflect on your own listening afterwards. So listen to recordings with a colleague for feedback.
Oh, that's brave.
Brings me back to my student days. Good luck with it. And identifying good and bad listening. And you know, I must say that was a very powerful thing that I did, you know, videoing certain parts of your session to send to parents before you do watching and thinking, oi. So, yeah. And then asking good meaning-making questions that allow dilemmatic thinking. I love that word. Reassuring speakers that uncertainties and lack of clarity are common. So I think we all think that everybody says what they mean and knows what they mean, you know, knows what they feel. And we understand that our own selves, you know, we very shift here and it can change and it's uncertain and we're not sure, but we assume that everybody else is black and white. And then, you know, I really enjoy this from Law, who says, explore the mess in their experiences and thoughts. And I think if you are going to do qualitative research, you have to be comfortable with a bit of a messy stuff, the real world mess. And ask questions that reveal new information. Jennifer, you said this. Now they said, do you have anything to add? Now, isn't that interesting? We know that something to add is better.
Some more to add.
Or what do you have to add would be even more encouraging. Consider wording. How did it happen versus why did it happen? And I also thought of that example. What questions do you have versus do you have any questions?
Yeah.
And we know that from the CA literature produces a very different response.
Yeah.
Also, this for me is a big one. It sounds so obvious. Give time to answer. And, you know, that telescoping responses, they call it, which is quite nice. You know, that quick fire, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer.
Yeah, students always fall into that trap when they start clinical work.
Yeah.
And you often, the first thing I have to say to them is just embrace the silence. Like, it's okay not to say anything.
Yeah.
Because then they get into this mode of just shooting off questions. And there's often a child in a therapy session is just sitting there staring at them.
Particularly with children, you know, that time to respond is one of the biggest language stimulation things. But yeah, that being comfortable with silence is not easy. Yeah. But I think it's something we also have to be aware of.
Absolutely, yeah.
So they concluded that listening is not natural or easy, that it's important to establish trust. Listening is important to establish trust, and trust is vital for any kind of qualitative research or any kind of research. They suggest you include how you practice good listening when writing up the research, which I thought was interesting. And that it's crucial for rich data or thick descriptions. It fosters psychological safety, and it helps speakers with uncertainties and complexities in their lived experiences that reflect the mess and contradictory thoughts of real life, which I really like.
Sure. Yeah. So I think we like this messy realities. Yes. But this is interesting that they're saying you should include descriptions of how you practice good listening.
I also thought that one.
I mean, the average journal, how do you squash also? Yes, so how do you prove it, but also how do you fit that into the average journal article? But I guess it's something that get into the habit of reflecting on.
I think it is a very critical part. I mean, if you think back of that cartoon, he's got 50% communication skills. He can talk, but he can't listen. You know, I mean, it kind of goes back to, you know,
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess the lesson here is really to interrogate our own practices a lot more.
And not just assume things.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. And really give it a lot more reflective thought before going into a session. I've got another focus group tomorrow with our our standardized patients. So that's going to be interesting. Saunder's going to help me with that.
Oh, brilliant.
So now we need to think a little bit about how we're going to do that. Yeah.
So if we just look at caveats and limitations, I think the first one is absolutely vital. Is good listening doesn't overcome bias. Now, they do talk about that fact, being aware of your inner dialogue. You must be non-judgmental, but they actually don't say that it's always going to work. You know, it's not a systematic or scientific exercise, so it's not a checklist that you can tick off. Eye contact, tick. Solar, S-O-L-E-R, tick. You know, you can't do that. And then they just like threw in There are interpersonal, cultural, and gender differences that need further exploration.
Yeah.
Yes. I
Yeah.
think that is a minefield of what is culturally
Mm.
appropriate, what is gender specific. One of the cartoons had that, like the cone for the husband because it improves his listening. I mean, that's such a stereotype, but maybe there are gender differences. And maybe there are different ways that you maintain eye contact if you're dealing with an opposite gender versus the same gender and things like
Definitely.
that. So I think that's huge. And also, I think the social and political issues are massive. Sensitive populations, they talked about having habits of hiding because it's not psychologically safe, I would presume, with more powerful listeners. So, I suppose it involves what they will and won't talk about and what they will and won't share because it doesn't feel safe.
And I guess there's always that power imbalance and,
Absolutely. Even as a
regardless of-
researcher and an
Absolutely.
interviewer, and I mean, you had to deal with that a lot in your research with students.
Yeah, Nancy, so researching students,
Yeah,
it's a tricky
very
one.
hard.
Yeah.
Even clinical educators that are colleagues.
Oh, it's huge. It's massive.
So there's always power dynamics as a researcher.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure.
And you are vulnerable if you're being researched because they're trying to look for what you're not doing particularly well, because that's, or, yes, what you're doing well, but also what isn't right to improve. Yeah, because if it was fabulous, you probably wouldn't be researching it. But yeah, so my biggest problem with this paper is that the suggestions were based on laboratory interactions and their experience. Okay, so they said, I think we do need real life qualitative studies, and I've seen the value of conversation analysis in this. Things, for example, Stocko's work, that if you want somebody to agree to something in trauma counseling, you use the term, would you be willing? And that had been shown scientifically to improve what people responded to. Now, that was so powerful. My only
hostage negotiation.
Yes, that's right. Would you be willing to? And then like, how powerful is that?
The police have to speak to the
guy,
guy who's holding someone hostage to say, would you be willing to do this, or if someone's
because I mean, there's
Very
high
interesting.
stakes.
Yeah.
That's
Very
huge
interesting.
high stakes. So you need the right one.
you need the right words, and it's the trust again. Sort of establishing that.
The only problem I have with this is that words change. So you just look at the word passionate. If I hear it now, I get irritated. And remember when everybody was passionate about their new business, their job, their everything, and now it becomes overused and annoying. So my worry is something like, would you be willing? If somebody like telemarketers get hold of it because they know it works, then it becomes absolutely a problem. So I think that the actual terminology that you use has almost got a shelf life because of how it gets manipulated.
And how society changes.
Yes, I mean, look at words to describe autism or mental retardation. I mean, we keep changing the terminology when it becomes common day. The minute it becomes common use, we feel we need to change it to something.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think that we have got there is a problem with which words use or which things should we do, because it can become inauthentic.
Absolutely,
And,
yeah.
I
So-
suppose that's why they haven't gone for specifics here.
Absolutely. But this has been a fascinating discussion. I feel like we could keep talking about this.
Sorry.
But thank you, Rona. This was hugely insightful, lovely paper. And thank you for leading today so expertly. I don't know if anybody else online has any closing thoughts before we end the day. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot to think about and take away from our session. Yeah, thanks, Charmaine, and thank you to those online. Yeah, thanks for joining and sharing with us. So we'll see you again in April with another online qualitative session. So thanks everyone for joining, and have a good day further. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Jenny, I'll join the
Yes.
staff meeting. It's just the